It's funny how fast we jump to conclusions on big economic stuff like tariffs.
Yeah, the hot takes fly around pretty quickly.
Exactly. So today, we're not really about those hot takes. You've shared some really insightful analyses on those Trump-era tariffs.
That's right, from a few years back.
And the idea is to kind of cut through the noise, understand the economic thinking behind them, and what the potential fallout might be.
Precisely. It's easy to just react to headlines, isn't it? But to really get it, you have to dig into the why and the what ifs.
Think of this as the shortcut, maybe, to grasp the core arguments.
Yeah, we want to pull out the basic logic, the possible consequences that these sources laid out so listeners can, form their own informed view.
Okay, so let's start right there,
Hmm.
at the foundation. Why were tariffs even, like, a serious proposal? The sources talk a lot about trade imbalances.
Right.
Can you sort of break down what a trade surplus and a trade deficit actually are, and why they became such a big deal?
Sure. Simply put, a trade surplus. That's when a country sells more stuff to the world than it buys back.
Okay, like China or Germany, the sources mentioned.
Exactly. They often have these surpluses. The sources suggest they tend to save more. Maybe their own demand doesn't soak up everything they make.
And the flip side,
Yeah.
the deficit.
That's when you're buying more from other countries than you're selling to them. Imports are greater than exports.
Which is where the U.S. has been for a
A
while.
considerable period, yes. The sources definitely highlight that.
Okay, so the U.S. is buying more than it's selling. But it's not just because Americans love imported TVs and cars, is it?
Hmm.
The sources hint at, like, deeper things going on.
That's right. I mean, American consumer demand is definitely part of the equation. But the sources point to more structural reasons, too.
Such as,
Well, for instance, countries with higher savings rates where maybe more income goes to companies or the government rather than straight to consumers, they just have more capital, to invest in making things and exporting them.
Right.
And then there's the role of the US dollar. It's seen as like a safe place globally for money.
safe haven, yeah.
So you get this constant flow of capital into the US, which also plays a part.
Okay, now here's where it gets a bit counterintuitive, maybe. The sources suggest that even though this money flowing in sounds good, like a sign of strength,
Mm.
a persistent trade deficit year after year can actually cause problems later on. What were the main worries they pointed out?
Well, the sources lay out a few linked issues. One big one is just growing national debt owed to other countries.
We're basically borrowing from abroad to pay for our imports?
In a sense, yes, financing consumption that way. Secondly, this growing debt, it can potentially lead to higher interest rates.
Making it more expensive to keep borrowing, or even just manage the existing debt.
Precisely. And thirdly, if there are economic wobbles elsewhere in the world, the sources mention Europe's problems around that time.
Well.
That can actually make things worse because even more money might flood into the U.S., seeking safety, pushing the dollar up, and potentially widening the deficit again. It's a complex cycle.
So, okay, you've got this backdrop, ongoing deficits, these potential long-term headaches. And the proposed solution, the big one, was tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
Based on what you read, can you just clearly define tariffs again? And what the main goal of those specific tariffs was?
Sure. So tariffs are basically just taxes. Taxes put on goods that are imported into a country
From other places.
from other places, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the primary goal, according to these sources for the Trump tariffs, was pretty straightforward. Make those foreign goods more expensive for Americans to buy.
Okay. Why? What was the intended effect of making them pricier?
Well, the core idea, the hope, was that if foreign stuff costs more, Americans, both consumers and businesses, would shift. They'd start buying more goods made right here in the United States instead.
And that connects directly back to tackling the trade deficit, doesn't it?
It does.
The thinking being, buy American, reduce imports, maybe boost U.S. savings somehow, and shrink that trade gap.
That's the intended chain reaction the sources describe.
that's true.
Exactly. And interestingly, they also kind of note that tariffs might have seemed like a politically easier option.
Easier than what?
Easier than, say, making big cuts to government spending or trying to put restrictions on foreign investment coming into the U.S. Those could be, politically tougher sells.
Right. Sometimes the path of least resistance politically isn't
Oh.
the most direct economic tool.
Got it. Now, the sources do mention a potential upside, or at least an argument for tariffs, this idea of leverage.
Ah, yes, the leverage argument.
How does that work? What's the thinking there?
What's fascinating there is the argument hinges on the sheer size of the U.S. market, We buy a lot of stuff from the world.
Okay.
So the argument basically is that this huge purchasing power gives the U.S. significant bargaining chips. The sources had that pretty blunt analogy.
Oh, was it? Something like, if you want to sell your stuff here in our huge market, then you need to give us something better in return.
Ah, okay. So use tariffs or the threat of them.
Right. To push other countries, maybe get them to lower their tariffs on American goods or change trade practices the U.S. saw as unfair. Basically, using access to our consumers as a negotiating tool.
That makes a certain kind of strategic sense, I guess, using market power.
It's an argument based on economic weight. Definitely.
However, and this is a big however, the sources also spend a lot of time on the counter-arguments, the potential downsides, the criticisms.
Oh, yes. Quite a bit.
Let's get into those. One of the first things they challenge is this whole idea that we need to have, like, perfectly balanced trade with every single country we trade with.
Yes, that's a key point of criticism in the sources. They reflect the sort of mainstream economic view that aiming for zero deficit or zero surplus with every single partner. It's not realistic.
And maybe not even desirable.
Probably not. I mean, the normal way global trade works is that countries specialize. You'll naturally run a deficit with some countries you buy a lot from and a surplus with others you sell a lot to. That's just trade.
That pattern is expected.
It's considered a normal part of how international economics functions. Trying to force perfect balance everywhere isn't really the goal.
Okay. And then we get to the really concrete potential negatives, the things that could hit people's wallets, or even the whole global economy. Prices, for one.
Absolutely. That's probably the most immediate worry raised. Tariffs make imported goods cost more. That cost often gets passed right along to consumers at the checkout.
So stuff just gets more expensive.
Potentially, yes. And it's not just imported finished goods. If American companies use imported parts or materials,
Ah, right, components.
and those get hit with tariffs, then the price of the final American-made product might go up too. It can ripple through.
Which sounds like it could fuel inflation.
That's the concern, yeah, that it could be a driver of inflation across the board. And then there's the other big risk they mention.
Which is the risk of, well, triggering a much bigger problem, a global economic slowdown, or even a crisis.
Wow, okay. How so?
The sources bring up the historical parallel with caveats, of course, but they mention the Great Depression.
Seriously.
Yeah, pointing out that the wave of protectionism back then, countries throwing up trade barriers against each other, really deepened and spread the economic downturn. The fear is that widespread tariffs could spark retaliatory tariffs from other countries.
The trade war.
A trade war, exactly. And that kind of escalating conflict could seriously damage global trade flows and hurt economies everywhere. It's presented as a major gamble.
That's a really stark warning. But hang on, the sources also mention the counter-argument to the price hikes, right? Trump's expectation or hope?
Yes, they did.
Yep.
The hope, as presented in the sources, was that U.S. companies would respond to the tariffs
How?
by ramping up their own production here in the States, building factories, hiring workers, making the goods that were previously imported.
And if they did that, wouldn't that keep prices down? More domestic supply. That was the theory. That increased domestic competition would eventually fill the gap left by imports and keep prices from spiraling. That American industry would rise to the occasion.
Okay, makes sense as a theory. But what did the sources say about how likely that was or how quickly it could happen?
Well, that's where the sources inject a dose of caution. They acknowledge that this was the intended positive outcome,
Like,
but they also stress that it's not automatic, and it definitely takes time. You can't just flip a switch and have new factories appear overnight.
right.
There's uncertainty about whether companies would make those big investments, whether they could match the price and quality of imports quickly, or if they'd just enjoy the protection and raise their own prices too.
So a time lag and uncertainty about the actual response.
Exactly. That gap between imposing tariffs and potentially seeing a strong domestic supply response is highlighted as a key vulnerability or risk in the plan.
Okay, so stepping back then, we've looked at the rationale, the imbalances, the tariff mechanism, the leverage argument, the potential downsides like prices and global risks, the hopes for domestic production. How do these sources kind of wrap it all up? What's their overall assessment?
They seem to aim for a fairly objective summary, I'd say. They frame the tariffs as a really bold plan,
Bold meaning.
meaning ambitious, maybe disruptive, aimed at fundamentally changing America's role and relationship within the global economy, not just tweaking things.
Okay.
They absolutely acknowledge how controversial it was, using phrases like lots of smart people hate them, indicating the strong opposition from many economists.
Right. It wasn't universally popular.
Far from it. But crucially, they also argue that the policy wasn't just random. It was based on a specific economic idea, a rationale.
The one about tackling those persistent trade deficits we talked about.
Exactly, that core motivation. So while the sources clearly outline the significant risks of potential for failure, the negative consequences we discussed, they stop short of calling it doomed from the start.
So, more like a high-stakes gamble.
That's a good way to put it. They present it as a gamble. Risky, controversial, potentially unsuccessful, but stemming from a particular diagnosis of an economic problem. They don't endorse it, but they explain the logic behind it.
Right. So we've really unpacked quite a bit here. The arguments for and against these tariffs, the thinking behind them, the potential leverage, the serious risks, all filtered through these analyses you brought.
Yeah, it really shows just how tangled these big economic policy decisions can be. No easy answers.
Definitely not. It highlights the trade-offs, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And thinking about all that, the complexities, the potential gains versus the potential pains, it kind of leads to a big question, really, for everyone listening.
Yeah, what's up?
Well, considering everything we've discussed, the different arguments, the risks, the intended effects, what factors do you think are the most important ones to look at when we try to judge if a policy like this, in the long run, was a success or a failure?
That's a tough one.
It is. Because the global economy doesn't stand still, does it? So how do the different viewpoints we've touched on from the sources help you think about international trade today and where it might be heading?
That is a really powerful question to chew on. Hopefully this whole deep dive gives everyone a bit more context, a better framework maybe for thinking critically about this stuff, about trade and policy and how it all connects.
That's the goal. A foundation for more digging, more thinking.